All right, so we're going to continue our discussion of different kinds of obstacles to good critical thinking. And the first video, we just sort of went through, roughly speaking, some of the different ways this might happen. In the second video, we were thinking about some of the issues related to self-centered thinking, and especially as that relates to saving face and how different emotions can play an important role in influencing the way we think. Now, what I want to do is talk more specifically about some different kinds of group-centered thinking, different ways in which our thinking can be influenced by our environment, by the people we're around, or the people that we trust in a lot of situations. Right. So these are going to be different subtypes of this idea of group centered thinking. Now, the first one is just group or peer pressure. This is one you probably heard of. It's oftentimes discussed, especially in grade school. Don't be influenced by your peers. You know, the basic idea of don't go with the flow, don't do what everybody's doing. If everybody decided to jump off a bridge, would you follow them? So that's this idea of peer pressure. I think a lot of times it gets brought up when people are discussing things like alcohol or substance abuse, right? So don't be influenced by your peers in this regard. The basic idea is it's when the support or the reason that somebody gives for some particular belief, when it comes merely from your peers, you believe it just because your peers believed it. Now, you'll notice that the next kind of group centered thinking is very similar. All of these are, of course, going to be somewhat similar because they're different types of group centered thinking. So, the next one is appealing to popularity, right? This is very similar to peer pressure, but the idea is you believe some belief, you believe something simply because it's popular, right? You don't ever think about the reasons or evidence for the belief, you just accept it because everyone else accepts it. Or a third kind of group centered thinking is when you appeal to the common practice of something, when the support that you offer for some belief comes from the fact that some group of people have been doing this thing for a long time, or that's just the way we behave. That's the way that everybody does it around these parts. That's an appeal to tradition or appeal to common practice. So, with regard to popularity, here's an example from my own life. When I first moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, a long time ago, I went to the grocery store on a Saturday afternoon, and it was not very busy. There was hardly anyone in there. And the person at the register says, "Are you going to watch the game?" And I thought to myself, because I'm from Kansas City, I grew up watching the Kansas City Chiefs, which is not a college team. So I wasn't really in the business of watching college sports on Saturdays. As an undergraduate, I went to the University of Kansas, and KU is not really super well known for their football team. So it's just not something I did a lot. And so when the person at the register said, "Are you going to watch the game?" I was like, "What are you talking about?" I was kind of confused. And come to find out that everybody watches the Nebraska football team in Lincoln, Nebraska, right? It was just sort of assumed that if you were in Lincoln, Nebraska on a Saturday afternoon or morning in the fall, then of course you're going to be watching the big game, no matter whether they're doing well or not. Everybody watches them. And so this was the idea that everybody believes or everybody participates in this sort of practice because of its popularity. That's just what everybody does. Or you might think it is an example of common practice. Another sort of example that we might use when trying to illustrate this point of appealing to common practice, or maybe better appealing to tradition, is oftentimes this comes up with religious experience or with religious traditions. Different religions have different ways of doing things. I grew up in a Catholic household where, in that particular religion, you always genuflected. You always kind of did the sign of the cross when you came into the church and so forth. And I never really thought, why do we do this? Oftentimes it was just said, well, that's just what we do. That's just how we do things. That's just our tradition here. Sometimes appealing to common practice or tradition is perfectly fine, but we need to be careful though, because if that's the only justification that we're giving for some belief or something that might be really important, then that's probably not going to be sufficient. Especially when you're thinking about, for instance, government regulations, right? We wouldn't want to justify a government regulation simply because that's the way we've always done things. We've always had this regulation in place, therefore we must continue to have it in place. Well, maybe the regulation is causing more harm than good. What we need is some evidence, some justification for why we have that regulation in place. If all we're going to say is, well, we've been doing it for 50 years, so we're going to continue to do it, that itself may not be enough. Now, when we're thinking about different forms of group centered thinking, it's also important to think about this distinction between in group and out group thinking, especially as it relates to things like stereotyping. So, what exactly is in group, out group thinking? Well, the basic idea is you hold certain beliefs because everyone in that group holds a belief, and you reject other beliefs because they're outside of your group. This is the basic sort of believing something on party lines, right? So this oftentimes comes up with regard to voting, right? So maybe somebody's going to vote Democrat all the way up and down the ballot, no matter who it is that they're voting for or what, no matter what sort of principles or social policies or anything else that person happens to believe, right? So maybe they vote Democrat no matter who they are, or maybe they vote Republican no matter who they are, because that just is the part of the group that you're in, right? Or you vote against somebody because they're outside your group. This also involves stereotyping in a lot of different ways. I think that a classic example is somebody who's a fan, right? So, as I mentioned, I grew up in Kansas City. I'm a huge Kansas City Chiefs fan. And one thing that we would oftentimes say as Chiefs fans is that Raiders fans are terrible. Right, we were in this, still are in this really big rivalry with the Raiders, and so sometimes you would hear people, Chiefs fans like myself, people in my own family, criticizing Raiders fans as being rowdy and obnoxious and sort of mean and even sometimes dangerous. So we would stereotype them in this way. Or another example, again, based upon living in Kansas City, I grew up a Kansas City Royals fan. I love baseball and I loved going to the Kansas City Royals. And I could not stand the New York Yankees. And so a kind of stereotype that was always placed upon the New York Yankees was that they're arrogant and entitled. These fans, don't really understand baseball because, they've won so many different times. So they don't really know what it's like to go through the process of, many, many years losing and then eventually winning. Now, sometimes it's perfectly fine to have this kind of camaraderie as a part of a group. For instance, I'm a huge Pearl Jam fan, and there's lots of other Pearl Jam fans, and I have this sort of relationship with them. Not because I necessarily know them or anything, but because I can relate to them on that particular level. Or maybe a better example, and one that you're more likely to recognize, is being a Taylor Swift fan, being a Swiftie, right? You can probably relate to other people in that particular group. The problem is when you start criticizing or stereotyping people outside of that group simply on the basis that they're not in your group. Right. So this idea of stereotyping is when someone either explicitly or implicitly classifies certain individuals into different groups according to what you can understand as being oversimplified or maybe prejudice attitudes towards them, like the example of stereotyping Raiders fans as being rowdy and obnoxious, or stereotyping New York Yankees fans as being arrogant and entitled. In those types of examples, I think it's clear that there's oversimplified and prejudiced attitudes being displayed there. Now, there's this important term, tribalism, that I think actually is something that is happening in our society quite a lot. Tribalism is another form of in group, out group sort of thinking, but it's more than mere group affiliation, it's more than merely identifying with some group of people. Rather, this is a kind of an assertion of dominance. It's like being in a cult or an allegiance or obedience to some group, or more specifically, a kind of a group leader, some person who says, you must follow me, you must believe me, and everybody else is wrong. You can't trust anyone else. So this is more than just simply recognizing that you're a fan of Taylor Swift or a fan of the Chiefs. Rather, it's saying that anybody else that disagrees is wrong, right? This is the kind of you're with me or you're against me way of thinking. I think the sorts of examples that we might see on like social media or in other online environments are, things like screw the libs or, let's own the libs. This idea of we just want to show that liberals are wrong. We want to like embarrass them or make them suffer in some way. I think a lot of times in those sorts of examples, we're not paying attention to the nuances of what people believe. Instead, we're essentially attacking the person rather than the content of what that person believes, right? It's a kind of failure to recognize the nuances involved in such a way that it kind of forces this sort of dominance in a cult like allegiance or obedience sort of way. Of course, again, we might wonder, well, are we just doomed? Is there nothing we can do about this? And I think that that's too premature. I think there are things we can do. For instance, when we're trying to resist this problem of group-centered thinking, we can proportion the strength of your belief with the available evidence or the reasons that we have. So if you have this belief that all Yankee fans are arrogant and entitled, well, maybe we don't have much evidence for that. Maybe we've got, very, very few sort of secondhand reports that we've heard people say online, but that's not very strong evidence to think that that claim is true. Right, so maybe we should not believe that very strongly. In fact, maybe it'd be better to withhold judgment altogether with regard to a belief like that. But when we do have strong evidence, when we've kind of gone through the process of evaluating the evidence and the reasons and thought to ourselves, well, what are the nuances involved here? That's when we can believe strongly in some particular, point, even if it is something that's aligned with our group. So, with that in mind, I want you to think about this. I want you to consider what are some of the beliefs that you hold very strongly? What is the evidence for that belief? Do you have good reasons in support of that belief? Or is it something that you believe simply because it's popular or simply because that's just the way we've always done things? It's a part of our group. Or what about some of the beliefs that you have very weakly? You don't really have much evidence for them, right? Is that something that you should change? Should you update or reevaluate those sorts of beliefs? So that's something I want you to be thinking about when you start working on the quiz for this module.